Bruce, with your permission, I'm going to have Scott put a bow around the conversation. I am reminded as I listen to both Jerry and Paul, and I think the same will be true of Scott, that you and I, as faculty members at universities, when our students copy each other's work, it's called plagiarism. When we as faculty members copy each other's work, it's called academic flattery. And I find that both Jerry and Paul, as I am, taking notes, I look and I find two people who I think have just volunteered to be guest lecturers in my Foundations of Strategic Studies course. So with that, if you're okay, I will press on and we'll have Scott Tait finish it up. Scott, over to you.
Admiral, thanks. Admiral, I'm Bruce. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you for the very flattering intro. Bruce, I'm a little bit jealous because I spent 3 years in the UK, and I love the backdrop you've got there of what appears to be a country pub or some such building. So, okay, so I'm going to talk mostly about the character of naval warfare and where it's kind of heading today and how some of the tactical level technologies might play in. But I will start by saying I'm not as conflicted as Paul is on the purpose for a Navy. I think the eternal purpose for a Navy is to control the sea so that your nation can use it, or you can deny that use to others. The fact that our Navy has and is in an identity crisis, and that navies can and are often used for other purposes very effectively, doesn't change the single eternal reason why nations choose to build them. Now, the nature of naval warfare is very, very different from land warfare, and to understand what navies are, why they exist, and how they are the way they are, you have to really differentiate that. Naval warfare is inherently offensive, it's almost always decisive, and it is extraordinarily bloody. In land warfare, if a unit is reduced by approximately 10%, it's normally considered battle ineffective and pulled from the line. In naval warfare, casualty levels inside a ship or inside a group of ships, a squadron, an air squadron, range anywhere from 30 to 100% routinely. Once a battle starts, nothing is held in reserve. The offense, not the defense, dominates. So it's all in, and it's fire effectively first, as Wayne Hughes, a great naval tactician of recent times, would say. So the character of naval warfare is very different than of land warfare. It involves a lot of maneuver. It involves a lot of deception and other things, but ultimately it comes down to who can be the most aggressive, the fastest, and destroy the opposing force. Now, there are two types of naval power. There are fleets and there are forts. You can effectively project naval power from the land by way of aircraft or, originally by cannon fire. That's why we have forts at the opening of all of our ports from back in the days of sail. Then we moved on to airplanes, so land-based naval air, and then we moved on to missiles. The problem with fort-based, land-based naval power is that it can be maneuvered around by fleets. It's cheaper, but it's less effective, and it puts, although offense still dominates in the tactics, the strategy becomes defensive. You can keep people out of your waters, but you can't go aggressively operate in theirs, which means that when it comes to things like protecting your own trade, if you're a trading nation, which, by the way, more often than not, you see great navies developed by trading nations, both because they have an interest in using the seas, but they also generally have economies that can support expensive things like fleets. Which brings to the next point. These navies are incredibly expensive things. It requires an industrial base that you don't need to build an army. There's an old joke that says the Marines and the Army equip men, and the Navy and to some degree the Air Force man equipment. And that's true, and that goes to the points that both Jerry and Paul brought up about the technical nature of the service, but it also lends itself to a very, very expensive prospect, which is why you see very few great battles and very few great naval nations. because you need this interest in the seas and interest in trade, and then you need an economy that can support an incredibly expensive proposition, being a fleet. And it's also why that you rarely gamble your navy. You know, great naval battles occur infrequently because they are almost always decisive, and the country that loses almost never recovers. You simply can't rebuild a navy fast enough to get back in that game. So with all of history's great naval battles, they almost always indicate a strategic inflection. Now, what has changed? Well, I think a couple of things have changed in the modern era. Most importantly, it's range and targeting. It's kind of still an exchange of naval power to destroy forces, but it's happening at much greater ranges now than it did in the past. The Battle of Trafalgar was fought at a range of yards. During World War II, you were fighting maybe a range of 100 miles, maybe a little further with air power. Now you're fighting at many hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles with long-range offensive weapons, including cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, coming soon to a neighborhood near you, hypersonics. And some would argue that cyber, the advent of nuclear weapons certainly turned the world into a global tactical stage, but I'm going to skip the strategic. But cyber on a very tactical level has also turned the world into a global tactical stage. So the two big things in range and targeting, and with targeting, you have ubiquitous, what we would call scouting or surveillance. Thank compliments to all the commercial things that are available out there, plus the advent of our use of space, the way that other nations are able to leverage things that they never could have afforded to build themselves. You have near ubiquitous coverage of the world and the ability to target forces in a way that never happened before. And now the ability to reach out and strike them also. What's coming next, I think, is a greatly increased reliance on autonomy, so autonomous systems. I think artificial intelligence and the ability to consume amounts of data and make decisions or recommend decisions in a way that humans currently can't, especially stressed and tired humans. And then a flip, an inversion that really started back in the 1980s, but is accelerating, where it's not about military development leading commercialization, it's about commercial development leading military affairs, and militaries that are most able to capture commercial innovation will have a decisive lead over the others. So what are kind of the key characteristics of navies going forward? I think to be a victorious navy in the future, you're going to have three primary characteristics. You're going to have to be survivable in this world of ubiquitous surveillance and long-range strike. You're going to have endurance, because these wars are not going to be quick. They're going to be more like short, violent bursts than the constant grind that we've seen in the past. And you're going to have to be incredibly offensive, meaning lots and lots of offensive power, where for the past 70 years, the US Navy has really concentrated all its offense in our submarines and our air wings. We need to get back to a point where we've got a distributed offensive force with credible weapons spread across a good number of different types of platforms. It's going to be fought largely in what we call MCON, or emission control, again, due to that ubiquitous surveillance. This isn't going to be huge battles. Most likely, it's not going to be huge battle fleets seeking each other out. It's going to be broadly dispersed forces operating in a coordinated fashion, but not communicating directly with each other all the time, as we've come to expect. It's going to be highly dependent on electronic warfare, both for deception and for denying the sensors and communications of others, and because one of the benefits of having naval mobility is that anything that's going to strike you has to have a seeker, which is, seeker is the ability of a missile to find and strike a target on its own. Because by the time you launched a long-range missile, the platform it was launched at has moved. So the ability to have onboard targeting also provides a vulnerability which can be exploited by electronic warfare. And that can be upgraded much quicker than building a new weapon to defeat a weapon. So I think you're going to have highly MCON dependent battles, widely dispersed forces, extensive use of autonomy and extensive use of electronic warfare in navies going forward. Now, what sort of challenges does that imply? Well, that implies what Paul hinted at, which is a considerable reconfiguration of our force structure. And that brings with it a number of challenges in doctrine. How do you develop the operating procedures, if you will, standard operating procedures that allow humans to interact effectively with autonomy? Right now, we aren't even starting to really think about that. Training, getting the right humans, and I would argue more education than training. To Paul's point about, scholar warriors, training to me is what we do today, which is getting somebody to respond a certain way every time to the same stimulus. Whereas education is the ability to quickly identify and adapt to situations you haven't seen before. And we need to get out of a training mindset and into a much more educational mindset. It means a big change in budget, and it may not be a budget increase. If we start to rely more on smaller distributed autonomous systems, we could do this with a smaller budget. That, though, is very difficult because the budget is inherently political. And while we would see a decrease in the naval budget being an overall good for the nation, the fact that that's going to mean a transfer of dollars away from certain congressional districts and into others will be extremely hard to execute. And lastly, and probably most importantly, it's going to mean a significant shift in our culture. And that may be the most difficult of all of these things to do. You're going to have almost back to the folks that Paul was describing, where you had much younger people in command of smaller units out and about making judgments on their own. That's probably what the future looks like for us. And then you've got to manage this incredible transition period. And one of the characteristics of naval platforms is they generally have very long lives. They're big, they're industrial, they live for decades. So the force that's with us will be with us for the next 50 to 70 years. And it's going to live alongside and have to operate and fight alongside all of these new systems. So I see a transition period where we've got to be effective in our training, doctrine, and adaptation of both the legacy fleet that we have today as we transition into the fleet of tomorrow. So it may be that many of the platforms we've invested in thus far that are still in our fleet become essentially delivery platforms or motherships, or as I think Art Corbett would say, standoff forces for things that are able to stand in to highly contested environments. So that's my 2 cents. I'm subject to your questions.
Scott, thanks. I think that as advertised, we marched through kind of context, then navalized that context, if that's a word, navalized, and then brought it into the tactical eaches of what the U.S. Navy needs to become 2030 and beyond. I think the point that all three of you made, and that goes really to one of the first questions, is that we look at land forces and this idea of, even back to our Constitution, you raise and maintain armies. You build and maintain a navy. So this is inherently different, and it's very difficult, not just within the five-sided wind tunnel known as the Pentagon, but it is very difficult for our society to understand that inherent difference between land forces. And I love the way that all three of you went after it. Hey, we're going to, get this group together, we will equip them, and we will go fight. Kind of the militia mentality. Oh, by the way, this naval warfare thing, this is hugely capitally intensive, and you're going to build it. And so when you look at the future of naval warfare and the fleet, those platforms and weapon systems that you're going to go conduct this war with, this is a very long-term investment. And so all of those uncertainties that the three of you have talked about, how do you actually create a naval force that can cover, at least to some extent, that uncertainty area? And so it is just so different. But to get the society that it serves to understand it is a very difficult proposition. So with that, exactly what I was looking for, hopefully what Bruce was looking for to tee up the question and answer period. And I'm going to turn it over to Bruce to guide the discussion where he wants it to go at